Imagine finding a wooden building that has been standing for over 300 years, with no paint, no chemical treatment, and no sign of rot, insects, or fire damage. You might think that kind of wood simply doesn't exist anymore, but it does. And the method used to create it costs almost nothing. It requires no hardware store, no industrial chemicals, and no special machinery. Just fire, wood, and a technique that Japanese craftsmen have been quietly using since at least the 18th century. Here is the central mystery. Modern pressure-treated lumber, the kind used in decks and fences across America today, is filled with chemical preservatives that cost homeowners $8 to $14 per square foot and still needs replacing every 10 to 20 years. Yet a charred wooden board, made using nothing but a torch and a brush, has been proven to last well over a century in outdoor conditions. Why haven't we embraced this? And why does industry keep selling us something more expensive and less durable? In this video, we are going to explore exactly what this technique is, how it works at a chemical level, where it came from, why it almost disappeared, and how you can use it yourself today for a fraction of the cost of conventional treated wood. We will also look at what modern science has confirmed about its effectiveness, and compare it honestly with the alternatives that the building industry wants you to keep buying. By the end, you will see a very simple process in a completely different light. To understand why this technique matters, you first need to go back to 18th century Japan. The country at that time was heavily forested, and wood was the primary building material for homes, warehouses, temples, and fences. But Japan also has a very wet, humid climate. Summers bring heavy rains, typhoons pound the coastline, termites and wood-boring beetles are everywhere. Fire risk in tightly packed wooden cities was constant and devastating. Builders faced a very real problem. How do you make wood last in conditions that destroy it quickly? The answer they developed, known in Japanese as Shou Sugi Ban, translates roughly as burned cedar board. Some scholars trace early references to this practice back to the Edo period, roughly 1603 to 1868, when Japanese cities were rebuilding rapidly after a series of catastrophic fires. Master carpenters noticed something that ran against common sense. Wood that had already been partially burned was actually harder to burn again, and it resisted water and insects far better than untreated wood. They were not guessing. They had centuries of observation behind them. The technique was especially common in the Hyogo Prefecture region of western Japan, where farmers and craftsmen clad the lower walls of storehouses and rice barns in charred cedar boards. These structures needed to withstand not just rain and insects, but also the occasional spark from kitchen fires and fieldwork. Historians have documented surviving buildings in the Nishimura and Hyogo regions where charred siding applied in the early 19th century is still functional today. That means some of this original Shou Sugi Ban is over 200 years old and still doing its job. So what exactly is happening when you char wood? The process sounds almost too simple to be real. You take a plank of cedar, cypress, or pine. You hold a flame against the surface, moving it slowly and evenly until the outer layer turns black and begins to crackle into a pattern that looks a bit like alligator skin. You stop the burn at just the right moment. Then you let it cool, brush off the loose soot with a stiff brush, and optionally seal it with a light coat of natural oil. That is the entire process. But what happens inside that wood is genuinely remarkable. When wood burns, the outer layer of cellulose and hemicellulose, the organic compounds that rot-causing fungi and wood-boring insects rely on as food, are converted into carbon. Pure carbon does not rot. Fungi cannot digest it. Insects find nothing nutritious in it. Think of carbon as the biological equivalent of a locked door. There is simply nothing for the organisms that destroy wood to grab onto. The surface goes from being an inviting food source to being essentially inert. The charred layer also becomes hydrophobic, which means it repels water rather than absorbing it. Untreated wood acts like a sponge. It draws moisture in through its grain, swells, contracts, and over time, the repeated cycle of wet and dry causes cracking, splitting, and eventually rot. A properly charred surface, by contrast, sheds water almost like glass. Rain beads on it and runs off rather than soaking in. This dramatically slows the primary cycle that destroys most outdoor wood over time. There is also a thermal insulation effect that relates directly to fire resistance. When fire approaches a charred surface, it encounters a layer of carbon that does not ignite easily. The char acts as a natural insulating barrier, slowing the transfer of heat into the wood beneath. In contrast, raw wood ignites at relatively low temperatures and spreads flame quickly. The Japanese carpenters, who first developed Shou Sugi Ban, may not have known the chemistry, but they understood the result. A burned board is harder to burn again. Science, centuries later, confirmed they were right. Modern fire science gives us the numbers to back this up. Charred wood has been shown in laboratory tests to have an ignition temperature roughly 30 to 40% higher than untreated wood of the same species. A study conducted at Kyoto University in the 1990s documented that charred cedar, when exposed to standardized flame conditions, showed a burn propagation rate significantly slower than untreated samples. The carbon layer essentially sacrifices itself in a fire, protecting the structural core beneath for a meaningfully longer period. That additional time can be the difference between a fire that spreads and one that is contained. Now let's talk about insects, because this may be where Shou Sugi Ban earns its most dramatic reputation. Termites alone cause an estimated $5 billion in structural damage across the United States every single year. Wood-boring beetles, carpenter ants, and other insects cost hundreds of millions more. The conventional answer is chemical pesticide treatment, pressure injected into the wood under high pressure. But charred wood simply removes the invitation. Insects cannot digest carbon. There is no moisture, no cellulose, and no soft organic material for them to establish a colony in. Field research conducted in Japan and later replicated in Scandinavia found that charred wood panels placed in termite-active soil showed essentially zero penetration after 5 years of exposure. The control panels of untreated wood placed alongside them showed significant termite tunneling within the first 18 months. The difference was not subtle, it was total. And those Scandinavian researchers were testing the technique not out of nostalgia for Japanese tradition, but because their own building industry was searching for non-toxic, long-lasting alternatives to chemical wood preservatives. So why isn't everyone using this? Why are millions of American homeowners still buying chemically treated lumber that costs more, lasts less, and contains compounds that many researchers have raised concerns about? This is where the story takes a turn that will feel very familiar. The answer involves money, industry lobbying, and the slow erosion of traditional knowledge that tends to happen whenever a cheaper, simpler solution threatens a profitable one. After World War II, the American construction industry shifted rapidly toward mass production. Prefabricated homes, tract housing developments, and suburban expansion created enormous demand for standardized building materials. Chemical companies, many of which had developed industrial-scale preservation processes during wartime, stepped in with pressure-treated lumber. It was consistent, fast to produce, and easy to certify for building codes. It also required ongoing chemical supply chains, meaning repeat business. A technique that required only a torch and cost almost nothing did not fit the new industrial model. The chemical preservative of choice for decades was chromated copper arsenate, commonly known as CCA. It was extraordinarily effective at preventing rot and insect damage. It was also, as the name suggests, arsenate-based. In 2003, the Environmental Protection Agency reached an agreement with the wood treatment industry to phase CCA out of residential applications after decades of pressure from environmental and public health advocates. Studies had found detectable arsenic levels on the surfaces of treated wood, in surrounding soil, and in the ash produced when that wood was burned. The industry replaced CCA with newer compounds, primarily alkaline copper quaternary and copper azole. These are considered safer, but they still involve industrial chemical processes, specialized equipment, and ongoing costs. More importantly, they still leach small amounts of copper into surrounding soil over time, which has raised concerns among gardeners, farmers, and environmental scientists who observe effects on earthworms and other soil organisms. The preservatives work, but they are not neutral. They are a transaction with a cost that the price tag does not fully reflect. Meanwhile, in Japan, Shou Sugi Ban was continuing quietly, mostly in rural areas and among traditional craftsmen who had never abandoned it. But it was not appearing in American architecture schools or building codes. It was not being marketed, because there was nothing to sell. A contractor who tells a client to char their own fence boards with a propane torch earns nothing from that advice. A supplier selling pre-treated lumber earns a margin on every board. The economic incentive pointed entirely in one direction, and traditional knowledge moved in the other. The turning point came gradually in the early 2000s, when a generation of architects who had traveled to Japan or studied Japanese design began introducing Shou Sugi Ban in high-end residential and commercial projects in Europe and the United States. Design publications started featuring its striking visual aesthetic: the deep black surface, the subtle texture of the charred grain, the way it changes color subtly as it ages to a silvery gray. What had begun as a peasant farmer's preservation technique was suddenly appearing on the facades of award-winning architecture. And with that renewed attention came scientific scrutiny. Researchers at institutions, including Oregon State University's College of Forestry, began examining Shou Sugi Ban systematically. Their findings validated what Japanese craftsmen had known for generations, but they also added precision. The depth of the char layer matters significantly. A surface char of approximately 2 to 4 millimeters produces optimal results in most climates. Go shallower, and you sacrifice durability. Go deeper, and you begin to compromise the structural integrity of thinner boards. That narrow window of correct charring is where the skill resides. Oregon State researchers and others also found that the species of wood matters considerably. Japanese craftsmen traditionally used sugi, which is a species of Japanese cedar, and for good reason. Its grain structure allows even charring without excessive cracking, and its natural oils complement the hydrophobic properties of the char layer. American equivalents that perform well include western red cedar, Douglas fir, and certain grades of pine. Each species chars slightly differently, requiring adjustments in torch speed and distance. This is not a one-size-fits-all process, but it is one that any careful person can learn. There are 3 recognized levels of charring in the traditional Japanese system, each producing a different result. The first is called Shou Sugi Ban, or the light finish, where only the surface is darkened slightly, and the wood grain remains visible. This is primarily an aesthetic treatment with modest protective qualities. The second level produces the classic alligator skin texture, where the char is deeper and the carbon layer is thick enough to provide full rot, insect, and fire resistance. The third level is a deep char used in specialized applications where maximum protection is required, such as below-grade posts or in very wet climates. Let's walk through the process step by step as you would actually do it. First, you need a clean, dry board. Moisture content should be below 15% for best results. You can check this with an inexpensive moisture meter available at any hardware store for around $15 to $20. You lay the board on a non-flammable surface. A pair of sawhorses over gravel or concrete works well. You work outdoors or in a very well-ventilated space. You need a propane torch, the kind used for plumbing, which costs about $25 to $40. You move the torch flame in steady, overlapping passes along the wood surface, keeping it about 2 to 4 inches from the board. You watch for the surface to turn black and begin developing the characteristic crackle pattern. This typically takes 60 to 90 seconds per linear foot of board, depending on species and thickness. When the surface is uniformly black and the crackle pattern is well established, you move on. You do all 4 sides of each board for maximum protection. You let it cool completely before handling it, which takes about 15 to 20 minutes. Once cooled, you take a stiff bristled brush, a wire brush works well for this, and scrub the surface firmly to remove the loose soot and carbon particles that would otherwise transfer onto anything that touches the wood. This step also reveals the beautiful texture of the grain beneath, which is one of the reasons architects find this material so visually compelling. Some builders stop here. Others apply a light coat of tung oil, linseed oil, or a natural wood oil to further enhance water repellency and deepen the visual richness of the surface. The cost comparison with conventional options is striking. A standard 16-foot cedar fence board costs roughly $4 to $6 untreated. The propane to char it adds perhaps 50 cents per board at most. A natural oil finish adds another $1 or so. Total cost per board, $5 to $8, comparable to or even less than untreated lumber in some markets. Compare that to pressure-treated lumber at $8 to $14 per square foot, or composite decking at $15 to $30 per square foot. Shou Sugi Ban is not just effective. It is genuinely economical. Longevity is where the math becomes even more compelling. A properly done Shou Sugi Ban fence or siding, maintained with an occasional re-oiling every 10 to 15 years, can reasonably be expected to last 75 to over 100 years. Pressure-treated pine decking typically needs replacement every 15 to 25 years. Composite decking, which is marketed heavily as a low-maintenance option, usually carries a 25 to 30-year warranty, but often begins showing surface degradation, fading, and cracking at the 12 to 15-year mark. The lifetime cost calculation shifts dramatically when you think in decades rather than in years. There is also the question of what happens to this material at the end of its life. Pressure-treated lumber, particularly older CCA-treated wood, cannot be burned safely because the smoke contains toxic compounds. It cannot be composted. It often requires special disposal as a potentially hazardous material. Charred natural wood, by contrast, is just carbon and wood. It can be composted, chipped, or allowed to biodegrade safely. When you think about legacy, about the material you are leaving behind for the next generation, that difference is not trivial. Modern architects have pushed Shou Sugi Ban into genuinely ambitious applications. The technique is now being used in commercial retail buildings, private residences, landscape installations, outdoor furniture, and even interior wall paneling where fire codes permit it. Firms in New York, Portland, Chicago, and Los Angeles have specified it for high-visibility projects. In Europe, particularly in Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, it has moved from niche interest to mainstream architectural option, listed in building material catalogs alongside conventional cladding systems. A 2018 study published in the journal Construction and Building Materials examined the durability of Shou Sugi Ban cedar siding panels exposed to outdoor weathering conditions over a 48-month period. Researchers measured moisture absorption, surface degradation, fungal colonization, and structural integrity at regular intervals. The charred panels showed 91% less moisture absorption than untreated controls. Fungal colonization was essentially undetectable on charred surfaces throughout the study period, while control panels showed visible mold growth within the first winter. The study concluded that Shou Sugi Ban offers, and I quote, performance comparable to synthetic chemical treatments without associated toxicity. That last finding, the part about toxicity, is worth pausing on. The health concerns around conventional wood preservatives are real and documented. Children who play on pressure-treated decks and playsets have been shown in multiple studies to have elevated arsenic levels in their hands after contact, because the older CCA-treated wood leaches compounds onto the surface over time. The newer treatments are better, but the principle remains. You are putting industrial chemistry in places where people, pets, and children spend significant time. Shou Sugi Ban introduces none of that. It is simply burned wood. One common question people ask is whether charred wood is safe around fire. This sounds almost absurdly ironic, but it is a legitimate concern. The answer is yes, and here is why. The charring process oxidizes the volatile compounds in the wood surface that would ordinarily help a fire spread. Once those compounds are gone, what remains is primarily carbon, which has a very high ignition temperature and burns slowly, if at all, under typical conditions. The char layer essentially acts as a built-in fire retardant. This is why Shou Sugi Ban has been approved for use in fire-prone regions of California and Australia. California is worth focusing on specifically. The state's building codes have been dramatically rewritten in recent years in response to catastrophic wildfire seasons. Homeowners in high-risk zones are now required to use ignition-resistant or non-combustible materials for exterior siding and decking. Many homeowners assumed this meant expensive engineered products, fiber cement, or metal cladding. But charred wood, particularly when tested to California's WUI, or Wildland Urban Interface standards, meets ignition resistance requirements in most classifications. Several California architects have begun specifying it specifically because of this property. Australia faces similar conditions, with extreme fire seasons that have destroyed tens of thousands of homes in recent decades. The CSIRO, which is Australia's national science agency, conducted tests on Shou Sugi Ban panels as part of a broader assessment of low-toxicity building materials suitable for bushfire-prone regions. Their preliminary findings supported the material's performance under ember attack, which is the primary mechanism by which homes ignite during bushfires, embers landing on combustible surfaces and smoldering. Charred surfaces presented significantly less ignition risk from ember contact than raw timber or even many synthetic cladding materials. It is also worth noting what Shou Sugi Ban does aesthetically, because for many people who use it today, the visual quality is as important as the functional one. Freshly charred wood has a deep, matte black surface with a subtle iridescence, almost like the feathers of a raven. Over the first few years outdoors, it begins to silver at the surface, developing a patina that most people find deeply beautiful. It is not uniform or synthetic looking. It changes with weather, season, and light. Architects describe it as a living surface, one that records its own history in its appearance. For those of you who are thinking about specific applications at home, let's be concrete about what Shou Sugi Ban is and isn't suitable for. It is ideal for exterior siding, fence boards, garden structures, raised bed surrounds, pergola posts and beams, garden furniture, and landscape edging. It is particularly well suited for outbuildings, sheds, chicken coops, and storage structures where you want maximum durability with minimum maintenance. It is not typically used for structural members that bear significant loads, because the charring reduces the cross-section of the wood slightly, and deep charring can affect bending strength. For raised vegetable garden beds, Shou Sugi Ban is an especially compelling choice. Conventional gardeners are often warned not to use pressure-treated lumber for raised beds where food is grown, because of the possibility that copper and other compounds can leach into the soil and be taken up by edible plants. Charred wood has no such concern. The carbon surface is stable and does not release anything harmful into the soil. You can build a raised bed that will last decades, looks beautiful, and is completely safe for food production. That is a genuine win on multiple levels. Let's also address maintenance honestly, because no material is truly zero maintenance. Shou Sugi Ban does require periodic attention. The charred surface, if left completely unfinished, will slowly weather and erode over years, gradually exposing fresh wood beneath. In very wet climates, this can become an issue after 10 to 15 years. The standard maintenance protocol is simple. Every 10 to 15 years, inspect the surface, and if the char layer appears thin or eroded, apply a fresh coat of natural oil, such as tung oil or linseed oil, or in some cases, re-char the surface with a torch, which takes only a few minutes per board. Compared to the alternatives, this maintenance schedule is remarkably light. A painted wood fence requires repainting every 3 to 5 years, a task that involves scraping, priming, and 2 coats of paint. A composite deck requires regular cleaning with specialized products to prevent surface mold and fading. Pressure-treated lumber needs checking annually for cracks, splits, and loose fasteners, and typically requires partial or full replacement within 2 decades. Shou Sugi Ban, once done correctly, mostly asks to be left alone. That is a profound quality in a world that increasingly sells us maintenance obligations we did not ask for. The environmental footprint of Shou Sugi Ban is also worth considering carefully. The charring process does release carbon dioxide, but the amount is small and confined to the surface layer. By dramatically extending the lifespan of wood products, the technique reduces the total number of trees needed over time. A fence that lasts 100 years uses half the timber of 2 50-year fences, and a fraction of the timber of 4 25-year fences. The carbon sequestered in long-lived wood also stays locked up for longer, reducing the net carbon cycle impact of building with wood. There is a deeper lesson here that goes beyond any particular building material. Traditional knowledge, the kind passed down through generations of craftsmen solving real problems with available resources, has a track record that modern industrial solutions rarely match. The craftsmen of Edo-period Japan did not have chemistry degrees. They did not have electron microscopes or laboratory burn chambers, but they had something arguably more valuable: hundreds of years of careful observation, trial and error, and honest feedback from the buildings they constructed. When those buildings lasted 2 centuries, the technique earned its place. The story of Shou Sugi Ban also illustrates something important about how knowledge gets lost and recovered. It doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes gradually, as economic incentives shift, as industrial alternatives crowd out traditional practices, as the craftsmen who carry the knowledge age and retire without passing it on. And then, sometimes, it comes back. Sometimes an architect stumbles across a 200-year-old barn wall in rural Japan. Sometimes a building scientist in Scandinavia runs a field test and discovers that the old farmers were right all along. Recovery is possible, but it requires people to pay attention. There are communities in the United States right now where this kind of knowledge recovery is already happening. Small-scale builders, homesteaders, and DIY enthusiasts have been sharing Shou Sugi Ban tutorials and results online for over a decade. Permaculture communities have adopted it for farm buildings and market stands. Natural builders and timber framers include it in their repertoire alongside other time-tested techniques like earthen plaster and lime wash. The knowledge is not lost. It is, in fact, spreading. But it is spreading through communities that value self-sufficiency and long-term thinking, not through mainstream building supply stores. One person's experience is instructive here. A retired carpenter in rural Vermont, who asked not to be named, but whose project was documented in a regional building trades newsletter, built a complete outbuilding using Shou Sugi Ban pine boards that he charred himself over a long weekend. Total material cost for the siding was under $400. He estimated that pressure-treated lumber for the same job would have cost over $900, and composite panels nearly $2,000. 4 years after completion, he reports zero rot, zero insect damage, and not a single board that needs replacing. The building looks, in his words, like it has always been there. It is also worth mentioning that Shou Sugi Ban has inspired a small but growing commercial industry. Several companies in the United States and Canada now sell pre-charred wood panels, kiln-dried and finished to precise specifications, for use in architectural projects. These commercial products typically cost between $9 and $20 per square foot, making them comparable to or slightly above conventional treated options. But they come with documented char depths, consistent finish quality, and in some cases, third-party fire and durability certifications. For contractors who need to meet building codes with documented materials, this is a practical path. The building code landscape is also slowly catching up. As of 2023, several states and municipalities have developed specific provisions for thermally modified and charred wood products in their residential and commercial building codes. California, Oregon, and Washington have been leaders in this area, driven partly by wildfire concerns and partly by the environmental building community's advocacy. The International Code Council, which develops the model codes used across much of the United States, has been reviewing thermally modified wood standards that would include charred wood products in a formal classification. This is genuinely significant progress. Some architects and researchers are now looking at variations on the basic Shou Sugi Ban process that could extend its applications further. One promising area involves combining charring with other natural treatments. Applying a dilute solution of iron sulfate, a compound used historically in Scandinavian wood preservation as well, to a freshly charred surface appears to further enhance both the aesthetic depth and the moisture resistance of the char layer. Another variation involves using biochar, the fine carbon material produced by controlled burning of organic waste, as an additive to natural oil finishes applied over charred wood. Early results are promising. The broader principle that Shou Sugi Ban represents, using a simple physical transformation to solve a complex problem without industrial chemistry, applies to dozens of other areas of building and home maintenance. It is a reminder that solutions do not have to be complicated to be effective. They do not have to come in a chemical container with a warning label. Sometimes the most durable answer is also the simplest one, and sometimes it has been sitting in plain sight for 300 years, waiting for us to remember it. There is something genuinely moving about the fact that a technique developed by Japanese rice farmers and city carpenters in the 18th century is now being specified by architects in London, Berlin, and Los Angeles. It traveled not through any marketing campaign or corporate promotion, but through the quiet persistence of quality. The boards lasted, the buildings stood, and eventually, people noticed. That is how the best ideas survive. Not by being sold, but by being undeniably good. Have you ever used Shou Sugi Ban yourself? or seen it used on a building near you? Drop a comment below and tell me what you thought of it. If this story of ancient ingenuity, quietly outlasting modern industry, resonated with you, there is much more to explore right here on this channel. We have covered other remarkable techniques that history nearly forgot: lime mortar that self-heals, earthen floors harder than concrete, and roofing materials that have outlasted every modern alternative. Each one carries the same lesson. The people who built things to last, and had no option to rebuild them cheaply, figured out solutions we are only now rediscovering. The wisdom was there all along. We just had to look for it.